Hello, everybody. My name is Snyderman, and welcome to Snyderman Teaches, the series that looks at historical events and their importance to modern society. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy it, and leave me a comment below on what topic you want me to cover next. But this episode, in the spirit of the 4th of July and the fact that Disney Plus releases Hamilton the Musical tomorrow, we are going to be looking at the historical inaccuracies of Hamilton the Musical. Okay. Before you go rushing to the comments and are like, you just hate Hamilton, I actually don't. I really love the musical. I've listened to the soundtrack more than I can count. I went and saw the musical in theaters. I own a very nerdy Hamilton t shirt that I have worn on this channel before. I've used the musical to help teach revolutionary America to my students, so I don't hate the musical. I am just a historian that recognizes that some of the things within the musical are not exactly the most accurate. That being said, this is Lin-Manuel Miranda, the author of the musical Hamilton, and if you don't know that already, how are you here? It's important to talk about here that Miranda himself acknowledges that there are some inaccuracies written in to his musical. He had to do that for the sake of the narrative that he was telling. There were some things that had to be left out. There were some things that had to be moved in the timeline in order for the musical itself to make the most sense. So while we can analyze Hamilton from a historical perspective, we also have to acknowledge that it is entertainment value. So there is this component of inaccuracy that we are going to have to deal with. It's also important to note that Hamilton the Musical was written based off of this biography written by Ron Chernow. Chernow was a consultant for Miranda as he wrote through his musical. So any of the inaccuracies that we're about to talk about had to be directly approved by Chernow. So while these are inaccuracies and they do change the narrative a little bit, you do have to acknowledge that these were approved by a Hamilton expert before the play was even completed. So let's start analyzing the musical and the characters and events that are within it, and comparing that to what actually occurred in history. This is Philip Schuyler. He is Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. He was a major general in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. He was a member of the Continental Congress, and he later becomes a senator for the state of New York, a position he would lose to Aaron Burr, which is represented by Miranda in the musical. So that's something that Hamilton the Musical gets correct. What Miranda does with Philip's narrative, though, that is incorrect, is he suggests that Philip only had 3 daughters, Angelica, Eliza, and Peggy. In reality, Schuyler had at least 7 children, and of those 7 children, at least 2 of them were sons, which means that the narrative of Angelica, his oldest daughter pictured here, is wrong. When you meet Angelica early on in the musical, she mentions that her only job is to marry rich. She's the one that has to social climb. She's the one that has to elevate her family's status, and that's simply not true. She would have had 2 brothers that would have done that for her family, so the pressure of Angelica marrying up, marrying somebody of a higher status, would have been a lot lower than what is actually portrayed in the musical. Another thing about Angelica's narrative that we aren't really sure about is the perceived love interest that she has with Alexander. Now, when you analyze the source material between these two, this is something that Miranda might not be wrong about. When you examine the letters between Angelica and Alexander, this idea of a love triangle between the two of them and Angelica's sister Eliza, who becomes Alexander's wife, is not all that far-fetched. The letters between Angelica and Alexander are very flirtatious. In fact, there's one example where Alexander writes to Angelica, "I seldom write to a lady without fancying the relation of lover and mistress." Clearly, that's not something you usually say to an in-law. But we know that this kind of flirtation and this idea of a romantic relationship didn't go one way. Angelica writes to Eliza in a letter that I love him being Alexander, very much. And if you were as generous as the old Romans, you would lend him to me for a while. This is an exchange that Miranda plays off of for the musical with the line, I'm just saying if you really loved me, you would share him. Now, conveniently in the musical, Angelica is single when she meets Alexander. That was absolutely not the case. Angelica was actually married at the time that she meets Hamilton. But Miranda took liberties by having Angelica get married after the meeting took place. We never meet John Baker Church, Angelica's husband in the musical, and the happiness of the marriage, both in the musical and outside, can be questioned. We know that Angelica was a very smart, intelligent woman, and Church was just absolutely not. He was kind of dull, kind of boring, wasn't really all that intelligent, and that actually makes her friendship with Alexander easier. The two were both very intelligent people, and if she wasn't happy in her marriage, the friendship was easier. The fact that both were married probably kept people from questioning their relationship and allowed them to show more affection than they would otherwise. The language from the letters could easily be explained away by the fact that in-laws were treated like blood relationships at this point. Okay? It means that the love that is expressed between the two could have been expressed without causing suspicion. So, the love triangle, possible. But in the end, an affair between the two, both in the musical, which never occurs, and outside of the musical, would be very unlikely. Okay? But it provides Miranda with the source material for a very entertaining subplot within the musical itself. But that leads us to Angelica's sister Eliza. Now, some will argue that Eliza deserved better than what she got from Hamilton the musical, and that the portrayal of her story in Hamilton is very much lacking. However, Miranda does portray Eliza as what she is, and that is perhaps one of the most interesting women in U.S. history. So what does Miranda get right with Eliza? Well, first of all, Eliza's letters to Alexander, some of the most important source material that we have in telling Hamilton's story, mysteriously disappear. That's right, we don't have some of the most important source material to tell Alexander's story because they're gone. Now, Miranda explains this disappearance of Eliza's letters with the song Burn. Burn is, in the musical, Eliza's reaction to the Reynolds pamphlet. You see, Alexander has himself a little steamy affair with a lady by the name of Maria Reynolds. And in order to defend his actions to the public, he writes the Reynolds pamphlet. We'll talk more about that later. But in Burn, Eliza uses the line, "Let future historians wonder how Eliza reacted when you broke her heart." And with that line, Miranda explains where Eliza's letters went. Because all throughout that song, she's just burning the letters, burning the memories of when you were mine. In reality, the letters were probably destroyed by Eliza and Alexander's son as a way to protect the intimacy found in his mother's letters, and she probably even gave him permission to do it. But the fact that her voice is silenced in history only makes her more interesting in the context of who Alexander was as a person and what we know about him already. Now, what the musical does get right with Eliza is all of the work that she does after her husband's death. She does create a private orphanage in her husband's memory. She does raise funds to create the Washington Monument. She does devote much of the rest of her life as a way to preserve her husband's legacy. And that makes her awesome in terms of United States history. But Miranda, at the end of the musical, makes it seem like it's because of Eliza that we remember Hamilton today. And that's simply not the case. In fact, Hamilton was one of the voiceless founding fathers until Hamilton the musical came out. So Eliza, unfortunately, is not the reason we remember Hamilton today. Hamilton is the reason we remember Hamilton today. And speaking of Hamilton, the character of Hamilton himself is where Miranda plays with the historical narrative the most. While many of the events that are presented in the musical actually happened to Hamilton, the correct order is sacrificed for the sake of the narrative that Miranda is creating. Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about is Hamilton's affair. Remember that with Mariah Reynolds? So Mariah was married at the time. She had a husband named James, and after finding out about the affair, James Reynolds actually blackmails Hamilton into giving him money. Basically, this money was hush money. It was a way for James to stay quiet while the affair with Mariah could continue. Now, in the musical, Jefferson, Madison, and Burr all suspect that Hamilton is embezzling government funds. So they confront him about it. And Hamilton reveals to them, well, I'm not embezzling funds, but all the checks that you are saying look suspicious are actually going to this guy because I've been sleeping with his wife. In reality, it wasn't these three guys. It was actually James Monroe who confronted Hamilton about government embezzlement. And Hamilton's like, actually, you need to keep this quiet, but I've been having an affair. Monroe tells some secretary in Congress, who then tells Jefferson, and that's how the story of the Reynolds affair gets out, and Hamilton then has to write the Reynolds pamphlet in response to that. So the news of the affair already got out before Hamilton wrote the Reynolds pamphlet, and that ends up leading to, or beginning to lead to, the end of Hamilton's political career. If we fast forward to the duel, there's a couple things that Miranda gets shaky about the duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander. First is the death of Alexander's son, Philip. Philip was actually killed in 1801 in a duel of his own. That was 1 year after the election of 1800, which Miranda says kind of caused this duel. And Philip was actually not killed on the count of 7. Instead, he and George Eaker, the guy that he was dueling with, were facing each other awkwardly for about a minute before Philip was going to fire his gun into the air. Eaker freaked out, thinking that Philip was trying to kill him, and shot Philip, killing Alexander's son. Fast forward to the actual duel. The duel between Hamilton and Burr occurs in 1804. Pretty long time to be holding a grudge against someone for costing you the presidential election, right? Well, that's actually because what really caused the duel between Burr and Hamilton was Hamilton ruining Burr's chances to become governor of New York State. Oh, and also, Burr didn't feel any remorse for killing Hamilton. Another thing that needs to be discussed is how Hamilton is portrayed in the musical Hamilton. Now, Hamilton is the hero of the musical, which makes sense because he's the focus of the story. But the narrative of Alexander the man is pretty inaccurate. The musical basically says that Alexander is an abolitionist, which is only partially true. The real Hamilton was absolutely anti-slavery, but there's also a lot of evidence that shows he sold many slaves in his lifetime, as many of the founding fathers did. They leave out the fact that Hamilton supported a monarch-like presidency. He wanted Washington to be more of like a king figure. And they kind of gloss over the fact that Hamilton himself was pretty much an elitist. He was looking out for the top 1% in America, which is blatantly obvious in his financial policy. Those are the inaccuracies that we find in Hamilton. put Hamilton into context, it's a musical. It's historical fiction and should be treated as such. It is going to have inaccuracies within the narrative that it tries to tell. However, despite all the inaccuracies within it, we should be thankful that Hamilton exists. It actually serves multiple purposes. First, it provides a framework for historical studies. You shouldn't use Hamilton as the end all be all of studying revolutionary America. Instead, it could provide you with a framework, it could provide you with a base to get your studies started. And then you could weed out the facts from Miranda's musical. And secondly, it gives a voice to a character in American history that had been silenced for so long. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, there wasn't much Hamilton before Hamilton. You've heard of all those other guys. Hamilton didn't get a lot of love before this. This has been Hamilton. Leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Leave me comments. I enjoy reading them. It lets me know what you're loving on the channel. And subscribe if you're not already. Have a good day, guys. See ya.